I remember the first time I did business with Joe Siegel, after whom this room is named. And I wanted to do a development in Point Grey at 5th and Highbury. And I was supposed to meet him in his office, but he couldn't see me, and he invited me to his house. And at the time, he was living in Rio Vista. Some of you will know the house on Southwest Marine Drive. And I'll never forget it, because when I arrived in his house, Lauren, his son, ushered me into the house and wanted to give me a tour of the ballroom and the dining rooms and the halls. And eventually I saw Joe in his study, and he sat down and I sat down, and he looked at this proposal I gave him, and he says, "Michael, it's a nice proposal. We like it. But I'm looking at your financial statements here. You're a well-known guy. You've done a lot of things. How come you don't have any money?" "Mr. Siegel," I said, "until tonight, I never really needed any." Well, money is a topic which really, I think, is on everyone's mind, especially when it comes to trying to afford a new home or rent a home in Vancouver. And so what I'd like to do is take some time and share with you some thoughts on the whole housing situation as I see it from my perspective as an architect and planner, but also as someone who has developed homes and also consulted on the development. And I must say it's very both flattering and pleasing to have so many of you in the room tonight, especially those of you who have had to listen to me talk before and still decided to come back. But I do want to say a special hello to the people who came into an empty room and still chose to sit in the very back room. The very back row, ye of little faith. My challenge tonight is to see if I can at least keep you in your seats for at least half of the talk. And you'll know when I'm halfway through, because one of the advantages of numbering a talk like this, 12 affordable ideas, is that you know when I'm on number 7, I'm halfway through. I'd like to start with 2 words. Thank you to SFU and to all of you for coming. But I need to share some private thoughts with you. I actually do know what many of you are thinking, because, as you know, my last name is Geller, and another famous person shares that name, my distant cousin Yuri. And we can both read minds. Not all of you, but some of you. There are some people here right now who are worried that all I'm going to do is repeat everything that was in my Christmas card in 2011. Indeed, this talk is inspired by many of the ideas that are in that, and you'll recognize them. For those of you who didn't get the card, this is the cover. At the back it says, "Unable to afford an affordable home. Please help." Some of you are wondering if I'm here to talk about the importance of high-rise. The fact is, high-rise is not the answer everywhere. It is in many places, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like this. That's not photoshopped. That's downtown Brisbane. And I couldn't decide between this and a shot of Dubai. Yes, I've always been interested in modular housing. And I often say when I go to communities around North America that while certain ideas cannot be transferred from one place to another, there's one housing idea that I've come across that I think is transferable everywhere. This one. Yes, I am going to talk about the NIMBYs. I don't think there are many of you in this room, but I do think that one of the things we have to talk about is the whole question of attitudes. Now, you can't read this, but today I must have got at least a dozen tweets from beautiful empty homes who couldn't believe that I wasn't going to spend the time I have allotted to me simply to talk about the problems of vacant houses and suites. Hopefully, some of you did come tonight, and I'll look forward to your questions. There's no doubt that this is a significant issue, and in fact, I wrote a column in the Courier about it and one in the Vancouver Sun. But as you'll see tonight, I'm going to focus on some other things. And yes, I'm not going to go on too long. There will be time for a conversation. So let's start. There's a couple of guiding principles that I think are very important, and that is we're all different and we all want different things. And just because you don't like apartments doesn't mean that everybody doesn't like apartments. And not only are all women different, all men are different too, as you can see. There's no one solution that suits everybody. So what we're going to talk about tonight is how we're going to look at new forms of housing, but also new forms of tenure. The need to change some of our government policies and regulations. By the way, I'm only reading this because I suspect the people in the last row can't. But if you can read it, can you put up your hands? Then it's terrific. So now I'll no longer read the slides on the screen. One of the things that always bothers me when people give presentations. But we're going to talk about attitudes. And I think at the end, one of the most important things, these partnerships of unlikely bedfellows, because to my mind, that's very much the key. Now, you can't all see this, but I got this out of an old English magazine. It's a very creative way of doubling the number of rooms in an old boarding house. I mean, why shouldn't the end of your bed be somebody else's table? The fact is, many of us, myself included, we grew up in houses like this, 36 by 24 feet, 864 square feet, plus a full basement. And at the end of the talk, I'd like to mention a little more about these kind of houses. But the first question I would put forward is, why don't we build these houses today? I challenge any of you to take me around to the new subdivisions in Surrey and Langley and Maple Ridge and find me a new house of less than 1,600 square feet. Even that may be a challenge. The fact is, because of the way our zoning regulations are written and the way we charge development cost levies, where often it doesn't matter whether it's a 2,400 square foot house or a 1,200 square foot house, you pay the same. And so psychologically, people are encouraged to build larger and larger homes. They've also been led to believe that that's what everyone wants. But it's not what everyone wants. There are many young couples or move-up buyers who would like a detached house, and rather than travel further and further away, they would settle for a smaller house if only it was being offered. And these pictures are from a development in Washington State, and there are a number like it, which are very, very popular. They're small homes, sometimes 1,000 square feet, 1,200 square feet. And they can be developed at densities of 12 and sometimes up to 15, 16 units per acre with detached houses. Whenever I go into a community and I show some of these pictures, even those who are absolutely opposed to what I'm trying to do say, you know, this is quite nice. And it is quite nice. These are what Ross Chapin calls pocket neighborhoods, where he'll design a number of small homes clustered around a common space. And just imagine, especially those of you who are my age, thinking about downsizing, how nice it would be to be able to move into a little community like this with a number of friends, maybe with a common room where you can have dining and perhaps even a little suite for the person who's going to pick up our dry cleaning and take care of us in years to come. So these are very, very nice. One of the other things is I go around Vancouver and many other municipalities, I see 50-foot lots, and I can't help but think, why don't we just subdivide many of these into 25-foot lots? These are pictures from a subdivision in Seattle where very large houses are still being built on very small lots. But because they're designed almost like multifamily housing with a coordinated look, it works out quite nicely. So yes, obviously one way to create more affordable housing is to make smaller homes on smaller lots. But there's obviously, and we know much about this now, an opportunity to create smaller suites in multifamily. And one of the buildings that got people talking in Vancouver was this one, the Burns Block, which was a renovated building in the Gastown area by Reliance Holdings. And the interesting thing is you think about the room differently. That's the living room, it's also the bedroom, it's also the kitchen. and you just redesign it. I always remember my friend Richard Henricus asking someone, how would you like to live in a 350 square foot apartment? Oh, they said, that's much too small. I could never live there. He said, how would you like to live on a 58-foot yacht? Oh, they said, I'd love to live on a 58-foot yacht. Well, when you measure it, it's about 350 square feet. But it's designed differently. Not everything is just miniaturized. Space is packaged differently. And that's what makes some of these smaller homes work. When I was in Auckland, New Zealand, I saw this building. I went for a tour, and the realtor said, this is one of our larger 2 bedrooms. It's 460 square feet. Now, to my mind, that was much too small. But when I looked at it and I saw how it was laid out and things folded out from the walls and the kitchen was very compact, it was workable. And indeed, you don't need to go to Auckland, New Zealand to see these micro suites or small suites. How many of you remember when Jack Poole and David Podmore talked about building affordable rental housing, and their first project was 600 Drake Street? Some of you drove by it on the way. As you can see, almost 2/3 of the units are less than 320 square feet. And one of the lines that I always remember about this building was the very witty and very clever Jonathan Baker, who was then an alderman, saying, it'll be like being in a coffin. And when I spoke to David Podmore in advance of another talk, he mentioned that this was one of their most successful rental buildings in terms of its occupancy. They rarely have empty suites, because for many people, this is a choice they can't find anywhere else. And if I had to have one word to describe the theme of tonight's talk, it's about choice, that let's give people more choice. A developer, a very innovative developer in Surrey has decided to build a condo project. When he first showed me the plans, I looked at a 290 square foot unit and I said, you know, Sharon, I think you need to have a suite size that starts with the number 3. So they're 320 square feet. Sharon had trouble with the banks. He had trouble with CMHC, but he's persevered. And I think it, again, will offer a choice. But one of the interesting things about these little micro suites is that the same space is where you sleep, where you bathe, where you cook, where you relax. The other thing, though, is I am nervous about the idea of a building that might have 200 or 300 of these small suites. And when I worked on the mayor's task force, we did a report on building form and design as part of Gregor Robertson's task force on affordable housing. One of the things we researched was what were attitudes towards small suites. And most of the architects and planners I spoke to said, yes, they should be offered, but let's not do very large buildings with hundreds of them, at least not at the beginning. The other thing is, to make it work, you really can't be requiring a parking space for every unit, because as you can appreciate, that parking space may cost $45,000. The unit may be $99,000, especially in a suburban location. So now we're moving on to number 2, another of my favorite topics, laneway and coach houses. I first got interested in laneway housing in 1974 when I was working for CMHC, and we did a study in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver with Peter Barnard and Associates called Sensitive Infill. And one of the ideas that came out of that was the notion of building houses along the lanes. And it took a long time, but thanks to both the NPA and the Vision Councils, both of whom supported this idea, we can now build laneway houses in the RS1 zones in Vancouver, and we can build coach houses in the RT zones. And people often ask me, what's the difference? The terms are somewhat interchangeable, although I think as a developer, I can get more money for a coach house than a laneway house. Let's just take a look at a couple of them. As many of you know, by the way, does anybody in this room live in a laneway house? Anybody have a laneway house? Anybody like to live in a laneway house? Would anybody like to buy a laneway house? Aha. The size of these homes generally relates to the size of the lot. And the city has been varying it for reasons that I'm going to show you in a minute. Now, many people are concerned that the houses are out of character with their immediate neighborhood. And this is a new Laneway house. Interestingly, it's a very modern, I think, attractive design attached to a very old house in a very old neighborhood. But if you think this is out of character, here's a Laneway house I saw in Toronto. I think that was actually designed by one of my former profs, which is why we often fought. So when I knew Laneway housing was coming, I created a company called Laneway Cottages, and some of the issues that I discussed with the city was what might be the maximum height. Personally, I wanted to see more single-level homes because if you think of them as for seniors, and indeed they could be attractive, a single-level home would be more attractive. I felt that we should allow different footprints, footprint being the shape of the building on the ground. But the city was very insistent that they be the size of the double garage. My preference would have been in some instances to allow a long, thin one because that might have actually allowed more space for parking on the site, which brings me, I went to City Council when the Laneway bylaw was being proposed and spoke against it because I was concerned that the city was going to not require another parking space for either the Laneway house or the basement suite, which would be permitted in the RS1 single-family zone. And my concern was not that I felt we should have more parking everywhere, but I worried that if there were parking problems in neighborhoods, a future government might well can the program. And I think in some neighborhoods this is an issue. As I mentioned, the whole question of tenure in the city of Vancouver, in the RS zones, these have to be rental. But if you're in a duplex zone, then, and you're protecting a heritage building, then you can sell a coach house. A number of other municipalities have recently adopted bylaws. North Vancouver City, District, and West Vancouver are all now allowing laneway houses, looking at different regulations than Vancouver. But I think it's generally a good thing. The only thing is you have to watch out for people who want to bend the rules. And this is one of the rules that has disturbed me the most. The builders who design their garages fully anticipating that as soon as the unit has been inspected by the city, it'll be converted into a living room. And the reason I know it's a living room and not a garage is invariably has in-floor radiant heat. And when I saw this next unit, I knew it wasn't going to be a garage forever because tell me, does this Volkswagen Beetle really need French doors? I can't see everybody in the room, but I will share a secret. The owner of this laneway house now sits on Vancouver City Council. Number 3, zero lot line housing. My very first job as an architect was in Toronto in 1972 with Irving Grossman Architect, and I got an opportunity to design what was going to be Canada's first zero lot line housing. And I will quickly tell a story that many of you have heard before. I had it all worked out like a checkerboard because some of the homes were to the side yard, some of the homes were to the front, and some were almost at the back. But they all were arranged on 30 by 80 foot lots at 12 units per acre. And one day a new guy joined me in the drafting room at the back of the office. He'd got a job because his father-in-law was a famous man and Irving wanted to help him out. And he was a very articulate guy, but he hated the idea of everything being all lined up. He said it should be on angles too. Like if you go to the most expensive neighborhoods, some of the homes are on different angles. And so Irving agreed, wanting to give him his word. And about 6 months later, Irving called me into his office to tell me that we had just lost another big job and he couldn't afford to keep Daniel and me. And so he was going to let me go, because he wasn't worried about me getting another job, but he was worried if Daniel could. And I'm not making this up. Daniel was Daniel Liebeskind. Zero lot line is not a new idea in Vancouver. In fact, when you look along all our arterial streets, all the commercial buildings are generally zero lot line, right? They're built up from side yard to side yard, often right to the front of the lot. But then when you look at the residential development, it always invariably has spaces on the side yards. Sometimes it's nice, sometimes it's useless. There's people in this room who I'm willing to bet have never walked along one of their side yards at their house. They have no idea what's going on back there. There may even be somebody living there. So although it's not part of our tradition to build from side yard to side yard, in some countries around the world, in fact in many, it is the norm. Indeed, and I chose this slide in case the mayor came. This is in Holland, where the buildings generally are lined up from side yard to side yard. Indeed, the old Dutch architecture of Amsterdam, this is what it was. And what's so interesting is when we look at these streetscapes, we quite admire them. Although if we look at them closely, we realize they are sometimes a little hodgepodge. When I was in Amsterdam 2 years ago, I was taken on a tour of a new development. These are all individually built homes by different owners, but with a very heavy degree of design control, and as you can see, I think a very attractive streetscape. I say, as a rule, design controls ensure a coordinated look, but not always, and that's because the Dutch government started to think, maybe we're over-regulating people. We didn't do that hundreds of years ago when Amsterdam and other cities were built. Perhaps we should do an experiment and let people build whatever they want on their lot, as long as it meets the fire code. They can go as high as they want, they can do whatever style they want, and they tried this out in a town called Almere, outside, in a overall master plan that's designed by spokes, and I know you want to see what that looks like from lower down. To me, it's not quite as attractive as old Amsterdam, but it's an intriguing concept of saying you can do what you want. Here's another view. One of the discussions that was taking place when I was there was somebody wanted to build a mosque in between two existing houses. But I think the point here is that as it slowly gets built out and as the trees grow, in a way, it's a very different approach to what we're doing now. So many people, since I started writing a column in the Courier, so many people phone me up or stop me on the street and want to tell me about their experience trying to renovate an old house on the east side or west side of Vancouver, talking about all the rules and regulations. James Bussey, the architect, is in the room tonight. He's trying to do a determination of what constitutes neighborhood character, because in order to get certain discretionary zoning approved in Vancouver, you have to respect the neighborhood character. So what is neighborhood character? Well, in Hamburg, Germany, it's this. Indeed, throughout the city, you'll see wonderful buildings, one jammed up against the other, but the overall streetscape is quite attractive. Again, going back to Amsterdam, some new mid-rise buildings built from lot line to lot line. But generally, when you think about Vancouver, we tend to build these little mid-rise apartment buildings, but then we have side yards and front yards and backyards, which really do sometimes leave little spaces in between. Yes, there may be windows, but you don't really need them. It's not just in Amsterdam or Germany. Those of you who've been to Spain know this, again, is a very generic form of housing. Now, it gets interesting when we translate this into Canadian vernacular. And here's an example that's just being built in downtown Toronto. Mid-rise buildings, lot line to lot line. Now, many of you I know are thinking, my God, it looks so cold, it looks so sterile. I hope they never do that in Vancouver. But the reality is, if we are concerned about making the best use of land, sometimes I think we really do need to rethink Should we be leaving these little side yards? Here's another view of that. It's in the King, Bathurst, downtown Toronto area. Mid-rise building forms. Let's go and try out another level of density. Duplexes and semis. What is the difference? A duplex is generally 2 units attached to one another. They may be side by side, but they can also be one behind the other or one above or below the other. How many people in this room live in a duplex? That's right. How many of you knew it was a strata development when you moved in? 1/3 of you. Because the reality is it is one property with a party wall, and basically you will have some decisions to be made. But many of my friends who are ready to downsize, a duplex around 14th and Burrard, or many Kitsilano, or many of Vancouver's established neighborhoods, is very much their desired form of housing. But I'm suggesting that in addition to encouraging more and more duplexes, not just in Vancouver, but in all the other municipalities as well, by the way, those of you at the back, there are some seats at the front if you want to saunter up. We should also be considering semi-detached housing. And what's the difference? Well, in a semi-detached, it's not a strata or condominium. Each half of the building sits on its own lot. And so you basically can do whatever you want. Now, sometimes there are regulations that control it. Many semi-detached homes are like Siamese twins. Each side is the duplicate of the other. But not always. And I would suggest that when you do a semi-detached house with an asymmetrical design and facade, you can begin to create a form of housing that is more affordable than a single detached house, but which could fit into an established neighborhood very, very nicely. And indeed, this one, you can see the 2 doors from the front, but in many instances, you could design these so that one door is in the front and one door is on the side, and then it truly reads like one big house. One of the problems with semi-detached housing is many people think of it as an inferior form of housing. It's for people who can't really afford a proper house. So for you, I'd like to show you these semis on Point Grey Road. I think each half is about $8 million now. I changed the line. This says this need not be considered second class. Before I said if it's good enough for the rich, it's good enough for the poor too. So now, if we were to take the idea of a coach house that could be sold and a duplex designed perhaps with an asymmetrical facade, and put those two together, you would get something like this. This is the development that I recently completed, or a year ago completed, in West Vancouver called Hollyburn Mews. Now I'm cheating a little bit. I'm just showing you one lot. In fact, as you'll see, it was 3 lots, but on each lot there's a duplex in the front, and as you can see from the little sketch, it was designed to look more like a big house, so the people who lived in big houses in the neighborhood wouldn't be too upset. And then in the back, coach houses, but not 600 square feet, 1,200 square feet plus a 600 square foot basement. One of the realtors said to me, "Do you know who's going to move into your coach houses?" "No," I said. She said, "Divorced fathers who get the kids every second weekend." So I was telling this to then Mayor Pam Goldsmith-Jones. She said, "What about divorced mothers?" I said, "Apparently they get to keep the big house." She said, "Not my friends." So this is it, and I thank Barbara Yaffe, who's in the audience, who did a little column about this and the need for other forms of innovative housing. Traslini Chetner were the builders. Bussy of Formworks were the architects. And these coach houses, this is the view from the lane today. And indeed, they didn't appeal to divorced fathers, but 2 of the 3 were sold to divorced women, and indeed a couple of the other units as well, because they were people who wanted to stay in the neighborhood but didn't want to pay $3 million. And there was a little story about this development in the Sun on Friday, and I got a note this morning from someone who said, could you please build something like this in Surrey? We don't want to move from our single-family house into 3-level townhomes. We'd love to move into something like this. So developers in the room, active in Surrey, you could do something like this. So you can see, yes, there's homes along the lane and there's homes along the street, but Stephen Mikicic and the other forward-looking planners in West Vancouver allowed us to relax the front setback a bit, to increase the space between, and overall, I think it worked out quite nicely. But it's not just West Vancouver. North Vancouver, especially the city, have been very innovative in terms of allowing 4-plexes and 6-plexes, replacing some of the older single-family houses. And again, we can talk about the architecture, but this is a concept that allows people to move into homes that might be 1,400 square feet in an established neighborhood. Some of you may have been listening to CBC this morning. I had a very interesting time on Thursday going around with Maggie Gallagher. And for those of you who've heard her but never seen her, yes, that's Maggie on the left. And that's a development that we walked by, and I say I know about this one because that home at the back is owned by a very forward-looking professor at UBC. That used to be Larry Frank's house. And he loved the idea of a home as part of a development that's making an efficient use of land. So now we're on to number 6, so we're moving along, and one of my favorite hobby horses, as many of you know, townhouse living is a very attractive form of housing. We're seeing some, not enough. I once suggested there's not one site on the entire west side of Vancouver that has not been built on, zoned for a townhouse development. And yet so many people want to move into townhouses. But many don't want to move into a townhouse because they're not sure they want to have to deal with a strata corporation. Fee simple row housing or townhousing is each unit sits on its own lot. They're individually owned. It's not part of a strata. And although we don't build them here, in Toronto, this is almost the norm now. So these are built as one row, but each one is individually owned. As it so happens, in the back, there actually is some communal parking for visitors. And that is shared, and there is a little strata agreement on that. But for the main house, people own it themselves. And one of the reasons why I think fee simple row housing would be an attractive option, especially for first-time buyers or move-up buyers, is when you think about it, why should it be that the people who can often least afford it have to pay a gardener to cut their grass? Which is the reality in virtually every strata development that I'm aware of. Now, I've been pitching this, but there was another wonderful man in Vancouver who promoted fee simple row houses for years, and some of you may remember him, and it's the late Art Cowie. And Art had great difficulty getting approval, but eventually he got a property at 33rd in Cambie, and he did 3 units. Now, these were designed in what Art thought would be an attractive aesthetic because he was going to live here. Whether it's everyone's taste or not, I don't know. But what was so interesting is this was a fee simple row house with a garage and a coach house. And they sat on the market for an extremely long period of time. And I never quite understood it, whether it was the aesthetic, whether people didn't understand the benefits of this being fee simple. I asked the realtor one day, she said, you know, a lot of people just don't want to be on Cambie Street. I said, you better go and tell that to the planning department. They're finalizing a plan for about 14,000 new units on Cambie Street. But one of the problems Art had was the city legal department wouldn't let him do it. And they said, we can't let you do it because you cannot have a party wall agreement that runs with the land in perpetuity. And there's lawyers in this room who know what I'm saying. So Art actually had to build 2 separate walls with a 1-inch airspace or 2-inch airspace in order to get approval from the city. But I am pleased to say that thanks to Suzanne Anton and a couple of other forward-thinking legislators, the act was changed, Land Title Act was changed to allow you to do this. But it isn't happening, and I was asked by Maggie Gallagher why some of these more innovative housing forms aren't happening, and I think it's true. Developers tend to do what other developers are doing or what their marketing people tell them will work. And up until now, they don't seem to get it, that a lot of people don't want to live in stratus. But I like to think that as we talk more about this and more people hear about it, then we'll have a greater demand. Okay, for those of you in the back row who said I'm going to leave when he's halfway through, number 7, rental housing. So this is Langara Gardens, and if you look carefully, you'll notice that the building on the left is slightly different than the building on the right. And that's because 1987, I was approached by Morris Wask. I was introduced by David Goodman, who's in this room. And Morris wanted to build himself a penthouse. And I said, Mr. Wask, if you want a penthouse, there'll have to be some people living below you. Yes, he said, I want to build another building at Langara Gardens that's identical to the ones that are already there, but I want a White House on the top. And we went in to see Ray Spaxman, and I said, we want to put up a 5th tower at Langara Gardens. And halfway through the meeting, he said, just a second, are there 4 there now or 3? I said, Mr. Spaxman, that's exactly our point. We all know those buildings don't belong there, but does it really matter if there's 1 more? George Puel was so determined to stop this from being approved, he moved the public hearing from City Hall to the community center nearby so that everybody would come out and oppose it. And they did. They not only opposed this, but I'm embarrassed to say they opposed a proposal by Ben Wask, Morris's brother, for the corner of 49th and Granville, where he had 1 acre with a big house and wanted to put a little infill development in the back. And because the system is not fair, Morris got approval for an 18-story building, and Ben got refused for an infill unit on a 1-acre lot at 49th and Granville. And that, to my mind, that level of unfairness still continues in many municipalities because of the way we write our zoning bylaws and our planning. But many people ask me, why don't we build more rental housing today? They should really be asking David Goodman because he's the expert. But I know a little bit about this because I worked for CMHC. And FP is a federal provincial program, and LD was the limited dividend rental program, and ARP was the assisted rental program, and CRISP was the Canada Rental Supply Program, and MERBs were the multiple unit rental program, residential building program. The point was the government constantly created these programs in order to encourage people to build rental housing. They also offered abilities for developers or owners to write off certain income against assets and so forth. And we stopped those programs. And so today, we have about 110,000 rental suites in Metro Vancouver, 3,100 buildings owned by 2,000, just over 2,000 people. Interestingly, in Vancouver alone, there's 1,780 buildings, but the next statistic is the one that's important. The average age of these units is older than most of you. It's 58 years old. And when you know people who are 58, you know they're generally not as good, in such good condition when compared with people who are 28. It's interesting that we've been building a lot of condos, and through creative marketing and design, I think it's astounding, really, that almost 40% of those condos are being purchased not by people to move into them, but by people who want to hold them as investments. And indeed, if you look over the last 20 years, those people who bought these units and rented them out, or indeed in many instances, for those of you who are tweeting me all day today, even those who left them empty for 5 or 8 years, they have generally appreciated in value to the point that they were sound investments. Now, it wasn't always this way. Again, I'll never forget the day I was in Morris's dining room and I heard a sound of coins or something in the kitchen. And I said, what are you doing, Maury, counting your money? He said, yes, I am. You want to come and see? And there the kitchen counters were full of quarters all over the place. And I made some facetious remark about, you don't need all these quarters. And that's when he said, Michael, when Ben and I started to build rental buildings, it was the coins from the washing machines and dryers that made the difference between making money and losing money, especially since the government didn't seem to know we had washing machines in these buildings. So we had a number of government rental buildings, programs, and that's the reason why so much of the housing was built around Vancouver and other Canadian cities. Indeed, we look at these little buildings. It's an interesting situation. You speak to many people who own these buildings, and you ask them, why don't you sell them? And they say, we can't sell them because the capital gain would be so great. But what they'd like to do is redevelop their site with a new rental building, because that way, as long as you don't change the use, accountants will tell you that you can avoid having to pay the capital gains tax. But they can't redevelop their buildings because too often they're located in zones which Vancouver has determined is a rate of change zone, which prevents the demolition of rental housing. Now, I don't want to say this facetiously or lightly. For the people who are living in these buildings, especially those who've been in them for a long time, these are their homes, and it would be a frightful thought if these buildings were to be knocked down. But the fact is, with a careful strategy, some of the people who own these buildings own multiple buildings. And they've said to me, we could arrange to relocate people from one building to another in order to empty out a building to redevelop, which is what Morris Wass did it when we built that tower at Langara. But unfortunately, the city policy is discouraging it. And my worry is that when these buildings are 58, they're a bit creaky. But when they're 78, they're not necessarily going to be in terribly good shape. And we need to do something to replenish the supply. Now, the city has, and other municipalities, but particularly Vancouver, have done a couple of things. At Bayshore, when I worked on the Bayshore project, at the last minute, Councillor Puel changed the zoning to say, instead of it being 2.75 FSR, it'll be 2.25, and you can have a 0.5 bonus if you build rental housing. And so that building at the corner of Cardero and Georgia, called Bayshore Outlook, which looks like a luxurious condo, is actually a rental building. And it proves there's a lot of people in Vancouver willing to pay very good rents for an attractive rental building. And the city, to its credit, has developed other programs to try and encourage the supply of rental housing. And most of you know about these two, and you're going to recognize the gentleman responsible for them. So the STIR program, which was introduced about 3 years ago, did indeed work in terms of encouraging people to build rental housing. Although I must say many of us in the development community had to smile when we saw what generous benefits our colleagues were getting in terms of density bonuses to build more condos and so forth, just to build rental housing. But it worked. So the incentives that made a difference, not requiring development cost levies, which could be $6,000, $8,000 per unit, reducing the parking. Often it wasn't that long ago, you often had to provide 1.5 parking spaces per apartment in Vancouver. Allowing the density bonus, so the rental housing did not count in the floor space. And expediting the process, because sometimes those of you who go through the development process know if you can get your project on the top of the pile, that can really help. But ironically, the one that I think which made a really big difference, the biggest difference, was the relaxation of the parking requirements. Now, that actually is not photoshopped. That's at the Arbutus Club. And the issue there was not a need to relax the parking requirements. It was just to understand how to park a BMW between another BMW and a Mercedes. So this is the reality in Vancouver right now. We have a very, very low vacancy rate, and as David will tell anybody who asks him, this rate of change anti-demolition bylaw is discouraging new development from people who will be willing to build new rental housing if only they were allowed to do it. So how do we encourage more rental housing? Well, the first way, I think, is in some zones to increase the densities. The irony is I now am getting incredibly upset with what I see are almost outrageous increases in densities. Some of you may know about a judge who recently commented on a project which he thought had been improperly processed through the public hearing system. And ironically, I have a column this week in the Courier. I was concerned about that project because it went from 5 FSR to 17.4 FSR. I'm not advocating that sort of increase, but I am suggesting that in many of our zones, we could go from 0.75 to 1 or 1.2. That might actually encourage the construction of smaller apartment buildings because, as you'll see in a minute, we don't build them anymore. The other thing is we need to look at a number of the existing buildings. A lot of them have parking in the backyard. You could add a little building over the parking. Or look at partnerships where a developer could team up with a nonprofit, as well as both provide incentives like the Rental 100 program, but remove the disincentives. But one of the things that has always bothered me as I go around the city is I see all the little apartment buildings where so many of us live. We're not replacing those, and I think we need to. So that bottom right, that's not a fancy big house. That's a new 6-suite apartment building I saw in a subdivision in Calgary. Why don't we allow something like that? But let's also look at some of the existing projects that have space around them, often in the parking lots, like Beach Towers. Some of you may know it on Beach Avenue, where again, I worked with the owners to try and do another tower that would fit in with the existing towers. Unfortunately, somebody opposed that. And the city said, well, we better not do a high-rise, so they've done a mid-rise building. But I believe at the end of the day, a high-rise would have been a better solution, actually, for the people who live behind it. I'm currently involved in another development in West Vancouver with the Hollyburn Properties family. And they have a number of properties. They keep them up very well. But they're now looking at whether on some of their sites they might gently intensify. So this is going from 1.75 FSR to 2.5. It would allow us to build 2 small buildings, one in the front of the building, one behind, designed to fit in at around and produce around 40, 45 new rental suites. And we're just going through the planning process in West Vancouver. As you might imagine, I met with many of the neighbors. They're all violently opposed to this because it's going to block their views or it's going to block the green space. They're concerned. But the reality is, if we keep stopping everyone from building more rental housing, we're going to have a problem. And as I say on this slide, and I'm not making this up, this will be the first purpose-built rental building in West Vancouver in over 40 years. Number 8, stacked townhouses. One of my favorite forms of housing because many people don't like it. But it offers a housing choice that often is not provided. This isn't an old idea. These are the Montreal maisonettes that many of you, if you're from Montreal, are very familiar with. I never understood how people could climb up those stairs in the middle of the winter, but they did. And in that case, those are two-story suites above one ground floor single suite. The funny thing is you don't see a lot of these in Vancouver, and yet if you go to Toronto, you'll see stacked townhouses all over the place. They're extremely popular, especially with younger couples wanting to buy their first home because they don't want an apartment in a 3-story building. Indeed, they often don't build those the way we do. But what they like about these, despite the stairs, is everybody has a front door right at the street. So in this case, that picture on the left, that's an individual single-level suite on the lower level. There's another single-level suite on the main, and then a 2-story with a roof terrace above. And I know what you're thinking. My God, that's a lot of stairs. Yes, it is. And it's not going to work for someone in a wheelchair. But for people who are looking for something other than an apartment, who can't afford a duplex or a single-family house, this is a real viable alternative. From an aesthetics point of view, you can dress them however you want. You want it to look Spanish, You want it to look Tudor, you can give it a variety of interesting looks. The one on the bottom left was very, very inexpensive. And while as an architect I might find it a little bit uncomfortable to look at, for the people who bought in there, they were buying a home with a front door at the street for significantly less than anybody else in Toronto. One of the challenges with this form of housing is the parking. And indeed, many of these buildings have underground parking, but a lot of the Toronto architects and developers have come up with some ingenious ways of tucking the parking in at grade, in garages, then building out over it. And there's a lot to be learned. One of the most interesting projects, and again, this is very, very dense, these are back-to-back stacked townhouses. But what's so interesting, the density on these is equivalent to a high-rise development at 2.5 FSR, with everybody getting their own door at grade. So if you are trying to intensify development in a neighborhood, here is an option. Now, we are doing it in Toronto, and those of you, again, who heard the CBC interview, the one on the bottom left is a little building around 17th in Quebec. That's 9 suites on one lot. And I think overall it fits in quite nicely. Some of you may recognize the one on the right, that's on Wall Street. But if you speak to that developer and hear the experience he had trying to take this through the city of Vancouver, never again will he ever try to build stacked townhouses. Not only did he have to provide sprinklers inside and outside, his engineer told him he didn't have enough water pressure for all the sprinklers. He had to build a reservoir in the basement of one of the buildings. He had to put an elevator from the parking garage to the deck, even though every unit either had to go up half a flight of stairs or down half a flight of stairs. But it's new. Okay, number 9. Speaking of new, looking at new ways of building. Before the talk, I was chatting with Barbara Yaffe, who was mentioning how a number of the developers are saying, what with the price of oil, what with the weakening Canadian dollar, and a number of other things, we're starting to see some significant increases in some construction materials. Rebar, for instance, is one. And at the beginning of the year, I did an article predicting, with some predictions, and one of the predictions, or last year, was we're going to start seeing a lot more 6-story wood frame. Now, many people will say, oh, I'll never build that. But the fact is, this is one way to create more affordable housing because the cost difference between 6-story wood and 6-story concrete can be $40 a foot or more. Now, you multiply that by 1,000 feet, plus add 15%, plus add 25% of soft costs and the developer's profit, that becomes quite a significant difference. And when you look at many of these buildings and drive down Cambie Street, I challenge you to tell which are the wood buildings and which are the concrete buildings. In some instances, it's very hard. Another way of saving construction cost is using factory production. Now, I've been saying this since 1971, and I've been proven wrong every year. Part of the problem is people think modular housing is more expensive because Habitat 67 was more expensive. But you go to other parts of the world and you start to see some interesting things. That development in front is on the Docklands in London, built out of containers. A lovely idea, a lovely little development. And in the back, a winning submission for a competition in New York to design new affordable housing. You can tell I've been going on about this for a long time. I just want to share, though, one particular idea that some people are going to walk out on. You're tired of hearing me say this, but whenever I hear about the problems of housing the homeless or people who need very, very low-income housing, I can't help but think of my thesis. My thesis in 1971 in Toronto was, when you look at downtown, there were always vacant parking lots and vacant sites. And I thought, I loved the concept of modular housing, mobile homes. I thought, why couldn't you get really well-designed mobile homes or relocatable modules, set them up on these sites, and leave them there for 3 years or 5 years until such time as the land is ready to be redeveloped, and then you move them somewhere else. And while my professor thought it was a disgusting idea, others thought it was quite a good idea, and I passed. But These are construction trailers that they use up in Fort McMurray. These are the executive units. They're little 10 by 10 rooms with a private bathroom for every room. And I would suggest that you could take units like this, and yes, they're boxy, but you could line them up. And somebody saw this and they said, that's a disgusting idea. They look awful. But then I showed them how they could be wrapped with murals, with that plastic wrap to look like the forest, which was the idea in this one, or with all kinds of geometric designs. And then they said, we hate this idea because they look so nice, they might not move. But it's interesting. These are two examples of modular units. That top one is a unit. And yes, you can't feel sorry for my wife. I make her see every project. That's Sally in the top and in the bottom. But that's a little module unit, 12 feet wide. It's got wheels. It can be relocated. The picture on the left is the inside with a modern kitchen along the back. It's a lovely little unit, about 520 square feet. And the one in the bottom is one that we stayed in Australia. And we woke up in the morning and we noticed they were delivering more units in this little development that we were staying in. I'd like to now talk a bit about flexible housing. As some of you know, I worked up at SFU for a number of years, and the students told me they thought that what I was doing was terrible. And when I asked them why, they said, you're just building housing for the rich. We'll never be able to live here. And I said, where do you live now? They say, well, we live in a basement suite. I said, well, we don't have any houses to have basement suites. But I got thinking, sometimes when you go to Whistler or a resort, you get a room and there's a door that takes you into another room. And I thought, why couldn't we design apartments, especially 3-bedroom apartments, where that third bedroom could also have a door to the corridor, where the little closet, half the closet, could be a little kitchenette. It's already got a nice bathroom. And that's what this drawing is. In this case, a 2-bedroom, where the blue is a 260 square foot suite. And I was talking to a journalist about this idea one day, and he said, well, why are you doing it? Well, I said, we're creating rental housing, and it's like having a mortgage helper in the sky. And there it is. To his credit, Councillor Louis liked this idea, and when Vancouver recently amended some of its zoning bylaws, it allows this to be done in Vancouver. Now, the irony is very few developers are doing it, with one exception. There are some lock-off suites, as they're sometimes called, being built in townhouse developments along Oak Street. But there's another idea. Why not build these little rental suites as part of new developments, whether they be apartments or townhouses? I'll tell you why. There's a reason why. How about this? In 1972, I moved to Ottawa, and I shared an apartment with Bernard Charon. And we could share an apartment because I slept in the bedroom and he slept in the living room. And the reason he could sleep in the living room was because it had a door. How many one-bedroom apartments have you seen lately where the living room had a door? None, because they all are inline kitchen, dining, living. But at SFU, I decided to try and build some apartments like the one I lived in Pestalozzi College, which I moved in because it had a co-ed sauna. And there were marijuana cellars on every floor. But this is a 1-bedroom unit, and as you can see, on the right, it's just a nice, gracious 1-bedroom with a double door leading into the living room. But 2 people, if they want to share it, you just close those double doors. And we even put different locks on those doors. And it's, again, 540 or 560 square feet, 2-bedroom unit. Here's another thought. I mentioned basements before. Some of these new basement suites are pretty nice. This is one on the west side of Vancouver. I mean, that basement is probably one of the nicest places to live. But it's so interesting that we are not only allowed, encouraged to provide basement suites in single-family houses, but we're not allowed to put them in duplexes or in townhouses. So I would like to put forward the idea that Vancouver should encourage basement suites, not just in single-family, but in all of the new duplex and townhouse developments, and just allow it. Because it's, again, It's a flexible form of housing. Many people may not rent that out. Many will use it as part of their suite, but it may be perfect for a caregiver at some time in the future, or an adult child who you want to live with you, but not too close. They can have their own entrance. 11, alternative financing arrangements. We've talked about ownership, we've talked about rental. There are other choices, you know. And so one of the ideas that I was intrigued with was something in the English called shared equity, where a nonprofit society or a community trust develops a project, and instead of buying the unit for $250,000, with a $50,000 down payment, you buy it for $125,000 with a $25,000 down payment, and you rent the other half. But as you get more income over time, you slowly buy more and more of your home until eventually you own the whole thing. And they've given a term for this. They call it staircasing, as you staircase your way to the heaven of home ownership. But it's an interesting idea, I think. So if you think of it, it's kind of what I'll call a hybrid ownership, in that you both own and rent. And as I say, you do it with somebody who you can trust. But I would suggest there's no reason why some developers couldn't do the same thing. They would have mortgages structured in order to make this happen. And then if they want, they could even sell those mortgages to an investor. Which brings me to another innovative thing. I asked Maggie Gallagher when we were talking about ideas, she said, well, what are you going to talk about? I said, I'm going to talk to them about SAM. Not my late father, Sam, but SAM, shared equity mortgages. How many of you have heard this? There's someone in this room who wants to buy a house, does not have the down payment. If you approach me or another investor, if I think you're a good risk, I may put up half your down payment on the understanding that I'll have a mortgage on the title, and when you go to sell it, if I've got half, I'll get half of the appreciation of that unit. If it doesn't go up, then I won't get anything. But if you think about it, it's an arrangement that many people are now doing with relatives, with the bank of mom and dad. But there's no reason why you couldn't begin to start to pool money to help people who are good risks, the kind of people, Gordon, who would come to a lecture like this. I would invest in anybody who's come to listen to me, except for the few who left a little earlier. I've always been intrigued with housing cooperatives. The one on the left, I saw that in Russia. I don't think it turned out that well. It looked much better when it was new. But I think co-op housing has a place, both nonprofit co-ops and market co-ops. And some of you say, what do you mean by market co-ops? Well, if you go to New York, co-ops are the most exclusive form of multifamily apartments in the city. Because on top of everything else, you can decide who gets to move in. Now, some of you think that's disgusting, but others would say, you know, I kind of like the protection that that provides. And there's a co-op right next to Highcroft in Shaughnessy, a number of little townhouses, and I had to write a letter of reference for former planning professor Dr. Michael Seelig when he decided to buy. And I have to tell you, it was with some hesitation that I wrote that. Because I knew once Seelig was in that development, the first thing he'd be doing is tearing up all the asphalt, replacing it with nice pavers, improving the landscaping, and that's exactly what he did. But he upgraded that development to the point that the last unit just sold to one of the city's most prominent lawyers, who's decided he's a lawyer, a wealthy lawyer. Co-op housing is for him. But one of the options for co-ops is for a group of people to get together and build a development. There's potential there. Another form of tenure, life leases. Very many variations, but the notion is you move in and you live in this unit for as long as you want. Now in the United States, some of these were designed for seniors who basically bought in based on their annuity tables. So if they were 98 years old, they paid a lot less than if they were 78 years old. The irony is many of the developers in the United States went broke doing this, because when people moved into these developments with the various supportive services, they started to beat the annuity tables. So they came up with a new concept in the United States for these seniors developments. They call it renting. Every month, you pay a certain amount for as long as you live there. But Life Lease has its place, and this is the Performing Arts Lodge at Bayshore, where a number of people paid $200,000, $250,000 for a unit that might well have been worth $350,000, but on condition that when they moved out, all they got back was $250,000. But by selling those 11 units, the nonprofit was able to get the $2.7 million it needed to then finance a project and provide rental subsidy units for the other members. And it's just a lovely idea, which brings me to my final 12th point, and I'm going to go quickly so we've got time. I think a lot of the future in creating affordable housing is through what I call these creative partnerships with unlikely bedfellows. Now, when I worked at CMHC, I know that everybody had a very disparaging attitude towards government officials. Indeed, I'll never forget the time I challenged the design of George Fernadjeff's project, may he rest in peace. And I'll never forget Mr. Fernadjeff saying, "Mr. Geller," he was a lovely, dignified man. "Mr. Geller," he said, "if you're so smart, why are you working for the government?" And he meant it, because in his mind, smart people didn't work for the government. That's not true today. There's a lot of very smart people working for the government. When I was president of UDI, and Jim Green was considering whether he should become a member, and while Jim and I had our battles over the years, I supported him because I felt it was an important role to have nonprofit developers as members of UDI. And I think Diera was the first nonprofit to be a member of UDI. And the developers looked at the nonprofits thinking, these well-intentioned people, and they haven't got a clue about money. And the nonprofits looked at all the UDI developers and said, look at these guys, all they care about is making money. They don't care about people. And as all of you know, that's not true. Yes, there's some nonprofits who don't understand money, and there's some developers who only care about money. But the rest of people in between could work together very, very effectively, because the nonprofits can do things that the developers can't do and vice versa. The other thing is a lot of nonprofits and charitable groups have land. And church parking lots, I think, are a wonderful opportunity to build new housing, both for congregants as well as for other people. And indeed, I recently saw a column in, I think, Business in Vancouver, one of the newspapers, on this very topic. Municipalities have land, and indeed, I know that our housing corporation is planning to use its land, but rather than just use the land that's been destined for housing, I think we should also be using land that's intended for other uses. For instance, they're going to rebuild the Dunbar Community Center. Why couldn't they put some housing on the top of that as part of the development? I'm not suggesting we use up any of the park or any of the green space. Just build it, design it so that you can make better use of the footprint. And this isn't just a brilliant thought on my part. In 1979, I moved to Toronto to manage the St. Lawrence redevelopment, and we built David Crombie Park, an apartment complex on top of 2 schools. You can do these things. It just takes a different attitude. Excuse me. At SFU, we were having trouble attracting faculty. At the university, we decided to build some staff housing. And so I put forward this idea to the city of Vancouver. As some of you know, when they were trying to decide what to do with the social housing units, Olympic Village, maybe you should make it workforce housing and sell it to faculty, or sell it to workers in the city. And I'll never forget the time that my wife and I were lying in bed listening to CBC radio, and there was Councillor Jeff Meggs proposing this rental housing for firefighters and police, and people were mocking him and saying, what a preposterous, ridiculous idea. And my wife said, why doesn't he just say, look, that was Michael Geller's stupid idea. If you want to know how innovative you can get in partnerships, check out the CMHC partnership program. One of my favorites, and I had a chance to judge some awards program one year, in a small Saskatchewan town, the school population was declining and the seniors population was increasing, and they took one of the schools and they designed it in such a way so that it was both a school and seniors housing, and the seniors could participate in some of the child care programs, and over time, as the school population decreased, the increase in seniors could be accommodated. And there's lots of ideas like that that I think need to be done. It's not just CMHC, BC Housing can play many roles as well. And chatting to Shane Ramsey about this chat, he said, you know, he's now taken over the chairmanship of something called Housing Partnership Canada. To tell you the truth, I never even heard of it. But it's a very interesting organization of different entities across the country promoting partnerships between developers and nonprofits and banks and companies building housing for their employees and so forth. And Shane also sent me an email, and because I might want to take advantage of this, I'm quoting him. He's got money which he's willing to make available not just for social housing, but for rental housing and affordable ownership housing. So I would like to conclude, but just to trick the people who thought I was nearly done, I would like to touch on 5 more things very, very quickly. Because without these next 5 things, none of the previous 12 things will work, to my mind. And the first one is, we have to review how we approve developments. We also have to look how we finance growth. We have to review all of our regulations and see whether they fit the new forms of housing. We have to recognize the whole NIMBY syndrome, and yes, we have to rethink our expectations. So in terms of the approval process, I once was hired by then GVRD to do a review of every municipality's zoning bylaw, and I counted there were 527 different zones in Metro Vancouver. 527. Every municipality had different public hearing procedures. The role of the urban design panel or the community advisory committee was different in each. We need to simplify all of that. But the most important thing we need to do is start thinking about zoning land for the use that we think it should be put towards, rather than improperly zoning land in the hope that a developer will come forward with the right kind of proposal, and then they can negotiate the community amenity contribution. And I say that, take a look at Vancouver. I told Gordon Price I was doing this. It's one of his favorites. Look how much of that map is white. Now, those aren't white people. That's white RS zoning, single-family zoning. What's so interesting is a lot of those arterials, they should be developed with townhouses and apartments. And indeed, if you come forward with an application on Dunbar or Cambie or Oak Street, you'll probably get it approved. But will the city rezone it in advance of you coming? No, because they want you to stand before them and beg. And they give them some money. We need to rethink how we finance growth. I don't think it's fair that those of you who are in this room who are planning to buy a new home, you're going to be likely paying, not just for your home, but for a portion of a social housing unit for someone somewhere else in Vancouver. You're struggling to afford a house, and yet we have a financing system where you're going to pay a community amenity contribution, which, if it's Cambie Quarter, is $55 a square foot. That means for a 900 square foot apartment, it's going to be over $57,000 just to go into a community amenity contribution fund to support social housing. Now, I agree that we need more social housing. We need to look after people who can't look after themselves. But why should you have to pay? And it's you. It's not the developer. I'm going to pass it on to you. If I can't pass it on, I probably won't do the project unless I can get a reasonable profit margin. So what I think we should be doing is looking at financing arrangements that we spread it out over more people and over more time. I think we need to revise our regulations. As I said, if you try to do a stacked townhouse project and meet Vancouver's sustainability requirements, you'll probably just not continue. It's just too challenging. Now, I'm not suggesting we should lower our standards. We just need to change them to recognize these new building forms. And look at these walk-up apartments that many of you live in. Many of us have lived in. They were the most affordable form of housing other than that illegal suite. And we can't build them anymore because they don't have elevators and they don't have 2 means of egress from the 6 units in the building. And that's wrong, in my opinion. The other thing that I think is wrong is too many politicians and planners make their decisions on housing and community planning not necessarily on the advice of experts, but like this. What do the neighbors think? And indeed, when planners write reports, they'll often say, we received 72 letters in favor of the project and 144 letters opposed. They don't go into saying whether the people who were opposed were more thoughtful than the people who were in favor, or whether there was a... They don't. They give the number, and that somehow is of importance to politicians. So what I say is let's stop being pollsters and start to lead, like the people featured in this project. Finally, I grew up in a house like this. Many of you grew up in a house like this. When I wandered around Quebec Street with Maggie, we saw all these little cute cottages. We don't build these anymore. We require 2 parking spaces for a single-family house in many metro municipalities, along with a paved driveway and at least a garage for one of those cars. I remember when you didn't have to provide any parking and you could have a gravel driveway. If nothing else, a gravel driveway is more sustainable than some of those pavement. When I started to look at housing, buyers didn't have to have granite countertops. They didn't have to have stainless appliances. And they weren't in the bathroom checking not only whether there was a shower stall, but whether it was a frameless glass shower stall. But in a way, we've started to create this climate that if you're going to buy a home, it has to have these features. I go around to a lot of housing. I have not seen one new unit with an arborite kitchen counter. But I can tell you, and the architects in this room can tell you, an arborite counter is a lot less expensive than a granite counter. And there's a lot of people who can't get into housing because developers are not building homes with linoleum and granite and arborite and more modestly priced and finished material. And if the unit is well designed, it can be very attractive. So what's the result of all this? Well, we hear it said in so many different ways. We do have unaffordability challenges. Now, as some have very thoughtfully pointed out, don't get seduced by that number that says the Vancouver housing market, everybody needs 10 times their income and they'll never be able to afford to buy. It doesn't always work that way. Many people are buying homes or moving up. They already have. Jonah Connolly has pointed this out, that they have some equity or they're getting some assistance, so it's not as dire. But I like to think that if we had more housing choices along the lines that I suggested today, and if we could all start to work together a little bit in terms of the government officials, with the nonprofits, and with the development communities, we're never going to make this as inexpensive a city to live in as Winnipeg, but we will be able to have more affordable housing in this region. Thank you very much for your attention.
You see those 2 mics? If you have a question for this gentleman, you've got to go to them because we're taping this and we'd like to hear what they are. So line up now. And you too are going to have to come here.
Oh, hi, Michael.
First of all, thank you for being so brave.
Well, I do have a reason for being up here. Gloria Vanzal, Cityscape Design Group. When I was with the City of North Vancouver, your brilliant SFU lock-off units for wealthy people actually allowed me to bring lock-off units to the Council of City of North Vancouver to sell it to them. I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's what it made it possible. Thanks.
Well, thank you. But you raise a very interesting point. Sometimes you go to the fire marshal and say, instead of having this giant roundabout, couldn't we have a hammerhead to turn your fire truck around? And he says no. But if you can say, they did it in North Vancouver, the North Vancouver fire marshal approved it, you won't be the first one, and here's a photograph I have of it, and if you want, here's the phone number of the fire marshal who approved it. All of a sudden, that other fire marshal may have a different attitude. And I've often believed that if we can get on-the-ground demonstrations of many of these ideas, whether it's the coach houses for sale, or whether it's the lock-off suites, or a 6-suiter apartment set in between 2 single-family houses, it makes it easier for people to imagine it and not be quite so scared of the unknown. So thank you for mentioning that. I guess go at the back and hi.
Oh, hi. Hi, Michael. This is Rosemary Cooper. So I noticed, first of all, great presentation, loved all the shared equity and lots of food for thought. I noticed in a lot of your comments you were talking about downsizing. So I'm in an upsize phase of my life, and I have a cold right now because I have a 3 and a 5-year-old. So many of my friends, the ones that are still here, have young families. And these are the 2 things they're looking for. Either they haven't found them and they've left, or they're struggling to find them right now, not necessarily in the city of Vancouver, they're going further afield. Adequate indoor living space with some child-adult separation. So when you think about that first house that you showed us, I saw it was a modest size, but you said, and a full basement. So I did actually get some ideas from reading your article in the paper where you talked about a sustainable living bonus where if you're going to sign up for a car share, pay $45,000 for a downstairs, internal garage space. Well, I'd like to pay the $45,000, please, and have a family sustainable unit where that's my downstairs rec room. So that's the first one. Are there other ways to do that? I've seen a ton of townhouses in the last year, and I'd love to see that not just in the city of Vancouver, but outside. That one seems like it's doable. Here's the tougher one. I've come up with a new term. It's not NIMBY, it's PIMBY, or HIMBY. I want to play in my backyard. I want to hang in my backyard. I don't care if it just belongs to me, it can be shared. Now, if you take some of those townhouse units and redesign them, maybe they become more expensive, I don't know, because you have to take a couple out to create that outdoor play space. But I think unless we do these 2 things and find a way to do it, then my friends are going to keep leaving. The young folks that I teach, the millennials that I teach, they're going to leave. So, any other ideas you have on this?
Well,
is it financially impossible, or are we just not being creative enough?
I was brought up, my father always encouraged me to read Edward de Bono, who is the fellow who coined lateral thinking. And when you start seeing the world through Edward de Bono's eyes, you do start to go mad, as I've demonstrated, but you do start to see things differently. Do you know why so many of these units don't have basements? Because municipalities won't allow them, because they basically say, if you want to have that basement, it counts in your floor space ratio. Even if it's completely below grade, it counts in the floor space ratio, and a developer will say, why should I provide it? I'd rather provide more space upstairs. Now, Edward de Bono would say, why are you not excluding any space that's below ground completely from the calculation of floor space ratio? Because it isn't adding to the bulk of the building. Yes, it may be increasing in some instances the number of people living in the dwelling, and that is a concern. But I think we need to speak out. Hollyburn Muse, Jim Bussey, the architect, will tell you, initially the units were designed without basements. I spoke to potential buyers, they all wanted a basement. So I went and begged for basements. And the planner, thank God she's left, after a huge screaming session, agreed I could have basements, but they couldn't have windows in them.
That's fine. It's still a downstairs rec room.
And so we then worked very, very hard to get windows in the basements. And recently, one of my buyers wanted to take me to show me what she had done with the basement, because we put in a 9-foot ceiling, so it didn't feel like a basement. We put in big windows with a window well. I mean, in West Vancouver, this is beautiful space. But your second point, again, we are so obsessed with the investors and the first-time buyers, we forget segments of the market. And one of the most interesting phenomena about Vancouver is that families with children, with choice, are now starting to think about moving into apartments in the city. Whereas in the rest of Canada, if you've got the money, you don't move into an apartment. And this is so unusual for North America that a number of years ago, a journalist called Linda Baker, who lives in Portland, came on behalf of the New York Times and wrote a column in the New York Times about the fact that families in Vancouver were moving into apartments, and on the North Shore of Falls Creek, the schools were overcrowded. And why shouldn't they be when you look at the environments we're creating? But I still feel that most developers have completely forgotten what it's like to have children, because they don't build. One of the reasons for the lock-off suites was it was one way that I thought I could convince some marketers to let their clients build 3-bedroom units, because otherwise they say, don't build 3-bedroom units, I can sell 2 at a higher price per square foot. So I actually agreed with the mayor and council in Vancouver when they said, we're going to start, if we have to, mandating that a certain percentage of the units have to have 3 bedrooms, because I think it's illegitimate. So those are two good points.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. Speaking of the city of Vancouver, but first we're going to go to you because you've been waiting.
Parking relaxations and CMHC, 2 different things. Talked about strange bedfellows. The first time we ever worked together was on putting car co-ops in at University at SFU, and Moto, the car co-op, never thought they'd be working so closely with so many developers, but it turned out to be a good thing. You barely touched on relaxation of parking requirements and how much that's affected, and how we can add to density without adding cars, because there are other ways of getting around, including walking and cycling. But CMHC, I guess I would say, men, allegedly, as they get older, testosterone starts to drop. And they compassion, empathy comes back in their lives. I'm wondering what you would do differently now. Let's say if you ran CMHC, or if you had decision-making power there now, what would you do differently than then? And with a federal election coming up and thinking about how they haven't been involved in social housing since 1992, what CMHC could be doing.
Councillor Carr, could you please sit down? I'm going to spend the next half hour just answering that question.
I'm used to that.
All right, I'm going to get to you a sec. So, parking relaxations. One of the ways we have done it, of course, is through the co-op car program. And you're right. It was, I can remember, again, most of the really good ideas I get from other people who I never give credit to. But in fact, it was a student of mine at SFU who said, in Germany, we package housing and transportation together. And sometimes, as part of your strata fees, you pay your transportation costs. And we talked about the idea even of shared cars and so forth. And that's why I decided, as part of the reduction in parking at SFU, partially because from a practical point of view, it was very expensive to build the parking spaces, we would try and get a car co-op going. I'd heard about car co-ops in the West End, and initially I thought you had to wear Birkenstocks to be a member of a car co-op, but discovered you didn't. And indeed, it turned out to be a great thing. Of course, we didn't have any people, so we actually bought a Prius, one of the first Priuses, to use for the car co-op, because I thought some people would even even like that. I did actually get a nice car-to-go slide, and then I forgot to put it in. But to those municipal officials who are saying, we'll let you reduce the number of parking spaces by 4 or 6 for every co-op car parking space you've got, thank you very much. And to those developers who are saying, you know, I'm actually going to provide a car with the development as part of it, just to make it a little easier for everybody, I think that's a great idea. Now, in our West Van project, rental project, which is going to cater primarily to seniors and empty nesters, although some move up, renters, I said we're going to reduce the parking, we're going to have car co-op spaces. And of course the planner said, people here aren't going to be interested in a car co-op. Well, they may not be interested in it today, but they will be interested in 2 years, and they will be in 4 years. And to those of you who have not yet bought a home or are thinking of moving up, if I had to give you any advice, I haven't a clue what's going to happen to house prices. I haven't got a clue what's going to happen to interest rates. But the one thing I do know is if you take the money that you might otherwise spend on a car and put that towards a mortgage, 10 years from now, you'll be so much further ahead financially. You'll say, thank God I went out on that rainy evening and listened to that guy who just kept going on and on and on. As for CMHC, I would love to resurrect a group that I worked for called the Research and Demonstration Group. And at one time I was the director of it, which is why I love the idea of trying out new ideas. And I would start building new ideas across the country. Now, I'd probably be a bit more thoughtful about them than I was back in 1981 when I tried to introduce compact housing to Revelstoke. And all the locals said, this isn't going to work here. I said, you know, the trouble with people like you in towns like this is you're not open to new ideas. They said, this isn't going to work here. Well, we built half the project. And when I went and saw 6 feet of snow piled up against these units, we actually had to demolish some units just so we'd have a place to put the snow. So you do have to listen to the local people. The other thing, though, is I think it's a shame that we've lost a lot of the research function that CMHC used to have. I'm not absolutely certain we have to bring back new programs, but certainly continuing to foster things like the public-private partnership centers and ranging marriages and so forth. But CMHC is moving away from the, I mean, I was there during the golden years. But I'm going to stop because we have Councillor Adrian Carr at the microphone. I'm so pleased you came. Did you bring your housing director with you?
No, but a notebook, and I took copious notes.
By the way, just on that, this is being taped, and it will be online in case anyone has the foolish notion that they might want to watch it again or something.
I'll just start with an aside. Thank you, Michael, for a brilliant talk. In terms of research functions in CMHC, my master's thesis in urban geography at UBC was under a grant from CMHC. So there was a lot of research money that was put out there. So 3 very quick questions. Financing growth, or CACs, you talked about in a very vague way. Most of it was precise, but vaguely you said you think the current CAC process should be replaced by something which spreads out over the cost over more people over time. So if you could explain that, that would be great. Secondly, you didn't really talk a lot about the cost of land into the equation in terms of unaffordability. And I'm wondering if you could maybe point to how changing CAC calculations, rezoning to give clear signals on what is and could be possibly built on land might help in that situation. And third, Michael, we just came through an election where consulting the public was a big issue. You said, just go be brave, council, make these changes, but I'm seeking from you some advice as to how you would advise council to actually get the public behind the kind of innovative changes so that there isn't there is a feeling of public desire for the change rather than antipathy.
So why don't we start with the last one first? And I think the answer I gave to the previous question about demonstration projects on the ground so people can see them is a good example. So let's talk specifics. Oak Street In 1994, I did the first rezoning on Oak Street to build some Jewish seniors housing next to Kaplan's Delicatessen. And it was a nightmare, but eventually it got built, and you can't see the building today because it's hidden by the trees, but there are 45 households that are very happily living there. In the subsequent years, a number of new developments, townhouse developments, have been built along Oak Street. There's now about 6 or 7 projects. We can see them. There's a couple of developers, one is Listrar, that are doing them. Every time they go to City Hall, they go through the rezoning process, excuse me, and they get approved. Why can't we just say from 41st to 54th along Oak Street, we're going to rezone it to allow projects just like these? Because if I pull up the zoning map, you'll see some red right at the intersections, but all along Oak Street, it's still zoned single family. And so there's a specific example. Dunbar. Somebody approached me, they would like to build some townhouses on Dunbar. Oh, I said, it's single family zoning, but let's go and meet one of the key community leaders, or a couple of them. We went and met them, they said, we'd love some townhouses. I said, but I'm not sure anyone's going to take the risk. You ask about land cost. The price of a 33-foot lot, the value of that lot is such that if we were to convert it to build townhouses, the price is $276 per square foot just for the land. So what that means is for a 1,000 square foot townhouse, we're already up to almost $300,000 for the land. Now if I rezone it, we're going to have a conversation as to whether I have to pay a community amenity contribution. Now some will say, well, if you only rezone it up to 1 FSR, there may not have to be a CAC, but if you go to 1.22, then you're going to have to pay a community amenity contribution. And it's going to be calculated based on the difference between the value of the land today as single family and the value that it will be worth as townhouses. And I say, but Councillor Carr, I don't know what it'll be worth in 2 years. I'll only know what it's worth when I sell these homes, and nobody has sold townhouses in this part of Dunbar before. But if I want to get the rezoning, I'm going to have to sit down with your real estate department, and it's not just you. It's the same in Burnaby and in Richmond and in North Vancouver and West Vancouver, and you're going to ask to see all of my numbers, and then we're going to discuss it. But it may well be that it's another $40 or $50 a foot for the community amenity contribution, which I will then, as I said before, have to add on to the price. And that's what's going on now. The interesting thing, though, is I spoke to someone tonight just before I came who said, you mustn't quote me, but you can say what I'm telling you. He said, I was talking to Councillor Meggs about all of this, and he said, I have a lot of ideas about how to reduce the cost of housing in Vancouver. He says, there's only one thing, and I need to tell this to you to your face. This will reduce the value of your False Creek condominium. And it's going to reduce the value of all of your neighbors in False Creek. And Councillor Meg said, this isn't really something I want to go to the voters with. And I'm being a little facetious, but the fact is we do have this dilemma that on one hand we want to reduce the price of housing, but on the other hand, I actually don't want to see my house go down in value by $250,000. And many of the other people who are well housed don't want to see the value of their homes dropped. And so we have to come up with some sort of creative way to balance those things out. But the fact is, the cost of land is very much now dictated by the value of single-family houses. And to take a 33-foot lot and put 2 townhouses on it, each one has got a land component of about $850,000. And that's before I've even started to build the townhouse. And will somebody pay $1.9 million for a townhouse on Dunbar? I don't think so, but I don't know. To go back to your first question, how do we spread this out? So when I did Oak Gardens, my father asked me if I could get some speed bumps in the lane, because people were racing down, and when he tried to pull out, and he was about 88 at the time, he worried that he'd get hit. So I went to engineering, and I said, I'd just like to put some speed bumps in. They said, well, you know, you finished your development now. If you'd done it before, we could have probably done it. You're going to have to now do it as a local improvement. That's how we do it, right? So everybody, 2/3 of the people in the block had to agree to these speed bumps. So my dad went around to the people in his building to see if they would contribute to the cost of the speed bumps, and they said, of course not. Why should we pay for your speed bumps, Sam? We don't drive. But he was a nice man, and eventually he got 2/3 of the people, and the speed bumps were in. And one day, Mrs. Slutsky came to his apartment, waving a piece of paper. Sam, she said, I just got the bill for your speed bumps. The only good thing is I can pay it now, or I can pay it off over 15 years. I'm 83 years old. I'm paying it off over 15 years, and my dad said, yes, Rose, I know you can do that. The only thing is, the one-time payment is only $46. But that's the point. So certain costs can be amortized over 15 years. We should be looking at long-term financing, and Michael is here. He can tell you how in the United States you'd be issuing bonds to build community centers and parks, 15-year bonds, 25-year bonds, to spread it out. So without going into all the details, that's the concept. But if it's $55 per foot, and not only that, I can't pay it when the building's finished and occupied and I get the money from the purchasers, I have to pay it right up front. And to add insult to injury, your lawyers make me sign a letter that says, I am voluntarily making this payment. You don't believe me. I am making it without any expectation of an approval.
Yes.
And some of these letters are a little more forceful than others, but I think the one that West Vancouver uses really does deserve an award, because I read the letter and I was so convinced that I wasn't being asked to give this money. I signed it without any hesitation against my lawyer's wishes. So quickly, the price of land, there's only so much we can do, but one way that we can bring it down a little bit, and the price of housing, is by competition. A lot of people complained about how expensive my townhouses, my units were in West Vancouver, and I'll be honest, they were sold for more than I ever expected to sell them for. But my realtor said, look, this is beautiful. I know the people here. They're selling homes for $3-4 million. Whether they pay 1.4 or 1.5 won't matter that much to them. And indeed, she was right. But if there'd been another development right next door to mine that was selling for 1.35, I would have sharpened my pencils. And I think that's why when we talk about the importance of competition, if I've got the only apartments in a neighborhood or the only 3 coach houses for sale in West Van, they're going to be a different price than if there's 3,000 coach houses for sale. But thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Michael, thank you. Thank you for the talk, but particularly thank you for telling some of real estate's dirty little secrets. One of my favorites being that in reality, we don't all want affordable housing. Those who have housing don't want to see the price of housing drop. But my favorite is the one that you alluded to, which is that the person who truly designs cities is the fire marshal. And that's because when somebody questions the fire marshal's decision, the fire marshal stands up in front of Councillor Carr and her colleagues and says,
babies will burn to death.
Babies will die, and that's the end of it. Okay. I'm going to get to parking again, but I do want to put in a plug for our program, City Conversations, in 3 days, Thursday, 12:30 to 1:30. We're going to talk about one of these CAC deals, and it's the one at Helmkin and Richards, where you have a 36-story tower. You were at the first session about it when we talked about when is big too big. We're going to talk about it again in light of the recent decision about public consultation. But what I particularly want to ask you about is parking. In San Francisco, as a general rule now, you need to provide 3/4 of a space per unit, 0.75, and they're going down to 0.5. What I'd like to know is, what are the rules here in our greenest city?
Okay. They vary. Actually, Vancouver has become cheers. Vancouver has become much more relaxed about parking relaxations. Compared to, it wasn't that long ago, you had to provide 1.5 spaces per apartment, regardless of its size. In some zones, it was 1 space for every 725 square feet. So it was a 1,500 square foot unit, it was 2. If it was a 340 square foot unit, it was 0.5. But Vancouver has been reducing its requirements, especially if you provide car sharing. But if Edward De Bono was here, he'd say, excuse me a second, are you saying that given our concerns about traffic congestion and greenhouse gases, municipalities impose a minimum parking requirement? Why aren't they imposing a maximum parking requirement? And indeed, the one thing I have suggested, and others have, we should overnight change all the minimum parking requirements to maximum requirements.
Which is what San Francisco did.
It would be good for everybody. But Vancouver is better. But in some municipalities, they are still charging 2 spaces per unit off-street, regardless of the size of the unit, and then complaining that it's not enough. Because as we all know, in some areas of Metro, there may well be 4 or 5 families living in a unit, and each household has 1 or 2 cars, and it's an issue. One of our projects in Surrey that Patrick Condon and I worked on at the beginning with the charrette, we got laneway houses, we got parking, compact streets, and it has become a nightmare because, like Revelstoke, it didn't fully take into account people's attitudes.
Would you advocate minimum or maximum parking requirements for Vancouver?
Do you know where I am? I actually think we need to distinguish between resident parking requirements and visitor parking requirements. Ironically, in many instances, Vancouver does not separate the two. Burnaby does, West Vancouver does, but Vancouver often, they just had a requirement for a total number of spaces. The reason I say that is if somebody wants to move into a building and they don't have a car, and they don't need a parking space, I think it's terrific if a developer is going to provide that choice to them. However, they may well have people who come and visit them on Friday night, and those people will drive cars. So out of respect for the neighbors, you have to have a visitor parking requirement. And I think any municipality that does not currently distinguish between resident and visitor spaces, it's time to reevaluate their requirements.
Thank you.
Thank you. 3 more questions. And we got 2, including yes, sir, at the back.
I lived in...
yeah, maybe that, or Brian. Yeah, I'll do you, because
Okay.
I know Brian, and
Okay. I lived in Vienna for a while, and what they are able to do is the city is a developer. So the city is able to do innovative things. The city is able to do lots of experimentation with forms and styles of housing. And the city is able to make money off of this, but a little less money. So Vienna has a grand old European feel, but is pretty affordable. Well, Whistler's done it a little bit.
Yeah.
They've done their own building. Is there any room for Vancouver to do this?
Yes. Well, before I started, Gordon asked me, are you going to talk about the South Shore of False Creek? Because, and I said, no, but you've invited me to. So in the 70s, the city of Vancouver created a number of separate little development groups staffed by pretty responsible, knowledgeable, capable people. And they were responsible for creating the redevelopment of the South Shore of False Creek, Champlain Heights neighborhood, the first 4 phases of Fraser Lands. And it all went very well. The city didn't lose any money. A lot of wonderful homes got built, including co-ops, market condominiums, and so forth. But more recently, the city took on the development of Southeast False Creek, and that didn't go quite so well. And I think it prompted a number of people to write letters to the editor saying the city should not be in the development business. To my mind, there is a role to be played by municipal governments, but you have to staff them. You actually do have to operate quite differently. And you also have to have an organizational structure so that you're not treating it administratively like you might treat other transactions, because the nature of development is different. But there are many examples. The City of Toronto had an incredibly effective housing corporation for many years. And I think it is possible for Vancouver to have one. But we now have one. We've just hired, I think, a $200,000 plus housing director. I'm disappointed that he's not here tonight, because some of these things might have been of interest. But there's no doubt that Vancouver is going to get into it, and we're going to watch and see how it works. But in other European cities, it is quite common as well. Hamburg, which I showed some pictures, a lot of that whole waterfront redevelopment was undertaken by an entity very much controlled by the municipal government.
And as you point out with False Creek, and relating that to a few of your developments, which you said haven't worked so well, development is risky, so a few of them won't work. And if you only do 2 and one doesn't work, this seems bad. If you do 100 and one doesn't work, maybe it doesn't seem so bad.
But it's really hard sometimes when you go to council and the councillors, the politicians say, you know, I'm not sure we really want to work with that developer because he supported a different party, you know. And if you think that doesn't happen, when I first picked an architect to do the Cordova house, hard to house, and I went to the minister and I said, I'd like to recommend Jonathan Yardley for this project. He's got a lot of experience. And he said, well, is he registered? I said, oh yeah, he's a registered architect. And somebody took me aside. No. They want to know if he's a registered liberal. Most developers, when they hire a contractor, they don't give a damn whether he voted for Vision or NPA or Green. They want the best contractor for the project. And unfortunately, too often, political decisions can interfere with when municipal governments or federal or provincial governments get into the development business. And afterwards, I'll tell you about working with Andre Ouellette. Brian, thanks for your question, Brian.
A couple of comments first.
Last one.
You just reminded me, when I worked for the federal government for 5 years in Pacific region, I had 3 prime ministers and 4 ministers in 5 years, and the bagman's list kept switching drawers just like that all the time. So, and I had to be careful how I picked consultants. A couple of quick comments. One of the ones, the apartments you showed where 2 people had separate bedrooms, or the living room had a door. My mother's house always had a door on the living room, which meant I had to live with strangers, damn it. We never got to use the living room. But we did do, in 1981, we did some apartments in North Vancouver where we had kitchen, dining, living down the middle, and 2 absolutely identical bedroom, bathroom complexes under separate keys, and they were called equal partner suites back in those days.
Commingling, we call
Yeah, and so that you could, 2 people who didn't have a relationship other than monetary could buy an apartment and still have their private space and share the public space. So we fiddle around with those ideas. The main point I wanted to make was community amenity
Contributions.
bullshit. Because we're going to sue one of the lower mainland municipalities this year over these things because it's not voluntary. They give us the text for the letter. That's by the legislation doesn't permit that, by the way. And the approach we're taking is what's done in the States. By the way, what we did is we paid them, we get the concrete in the ground, then we start the lawsuit. Just so we're very clear on how that works. But in the States...
You can do a lawsuit. You just don't want to go back and try and get another development permit in that municipality.
It's okay. There's lots of municipalities in the Lower Mainland. I can burn a few. And I'm old anyway, so I'm not going to get to them all by the time I die. The issue, though, in the States, where I also practice both architecture and planning, is that when you have a charge against a new project, it has to have both, and these are Supreme Court decisions, nexus and proportionality. And none of these things are being done that way. That is that the impact which they're trying to offset someplace else with your money has to have a direct connection to the impacts you're making on the community. Yes. That's a fair way of doing it, and certainly we would participate voluntarily into that type of an arrangement. And the other is proportionality. And this is an even bigger side of the issue. $55 a square foot or whatever you were looking at is not proportional to anything, and it totally eliminates the notion of affordable housing. And it shouldn't be, and we're taxing the people who aren't here yet for the stuff we want to do in the future. And because they don't vote yet, because they're not in the units yet. And it's a process we got into. We used to tax, through property taxes, we used to do all our improvements that way. Yes, development got faster and all the rest of it, but the fundamental issue is that it's a disproportionate tax, it's unfair, and it certainly has nothing to do with affordability.
I'm going to give you the last word on that. Thank you.